welcome people at home. It's wonderful to see you. Welcome to our event, Voices from Okinawa, the role of Canada and the U.S. in militarizing the Pacific. Welcome, welcome. We're joined by Chobin, Zukuran, Peter Kuznick, Satoko Oka Norimatsu, Okinawa activist Shinako Oyakawa, as well as John Price. I'm Bianca Mageni with the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, and we're one of the co-organizers of today's event, alongside Canada-China Focus, which is an initiative of CFPI, as well as the University of Victoria Centre for Global Studies. And I'm speaking to you all from Montreal, which is on the territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka people. That will also be filmed and broadcast on the UI channel, which is the internet channel of the East Asian Community Institute. So today's event is very timely. We're seeing U.S. Military officials openly talking now about war with China. We're seeing Canadian government preparing, participating, as we're going to talk about today, in the militarization of the Pacific. The Trudeau government recently released its Indo-Pacific strategy, which allocates $500 million to bolstering Canada's military and spy networks in the region. Also calls for dispatching more naval vessels as part of provocative naval missions with U.S. warships to the Taiwan Strait and South China Sea. We sent out an article actually with the invite to this event around the fact that Canadian warships and CP-140 Aurora surveillance aircraft have increasingly used military installations in Okinawa. And similarly, Ottawa celebrated Tokyo's December announcement about plans to massively increase military spending by $320 billion over 5 years. So there's a lot going on. And tonight's event is specifically going to look at the US and Canada's role in militarizing the Pacific, and also the resistance to militarism in Okinawa and the region. So welcome, welcome, welcome. We've got Chobin, Satoko, Shinako, and Miyuki, who are all live from Okinawa, which is very exciting. Peter's in Maryland. John is in Vancouver. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker of the, honestly, just depends on where you are, morning, afternoon, evening. The first speaker is Peter Kuznick. Peter is a professor of history and director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at the American University in Washington, D.C. He's co-author with Oliver Stone of The Untold History of the United States. And among his many books, co-author most recently with the former Japanese Prime Minister Yukio Hatoyama, Oliver Stone, Akira Kimura, of The Untold Post-War History of the United States and Japan, which came out in 2020. And Peter spent many, many years raising awareness against war and the use of nuclear weapons. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you, Bianca. I'm going to focus mostly on the U.S. role in militarizing the Pacific. But I wanted to start off by mentioning that this week, the world lost one of its most extraordinary citizens, Daniel Ellsberg. Most people know Dan as the former government and military analyst who leaked the classified study of the Vietnam War called the Pentagon Papers to the newspapers in 1971 in hoping to stop the U.S. invasion of Vietnam. For that crime, under the Espionage Act, Dan faced 115 years in prison and expected to spend the rest of his life behind bars. I didn't meet Dan for another 20 years or so, but we became very fast friends. In many ways, he was my closest friend in the world. He was widely viewed as the world's leading whistleblower, but he was much, much more than that. He, more than any single individual, spent his life warning against war in general and nuclear war in particular, because Dan understood how easily a war like the one now in Ukraine could evolve into a nuclear war, and how easily a limited nuclear exchange could evolve into a full-scale Armageddon, from which virtually no one would emerge alive. Dan did as much as anyone to warn about the reality of nuclear winter as a result of even a limited nuclear exchange. But at age 90, Dan released new classified documents showing how close the US came to using nuclear weapons against China during the Taiwan conflict in 1958, when US generals pushed for the US to use nuclear weapons, and they anticipated that the Soviet Union would respond in kind on behalf of its Chinese ally, and that millions of people would be killed. Dan hoped that he would, for a second time, be charged under the Espionage Act and have the chance to argue against it before the US Supreme Court to show that the act was unconstitutional and that charges should be dropped against Ed Snowden, Julian Assange, and others who leaked or published classified information in the public interest, not like Donald Trump, not like people giving it to other countries as spies, but in the public interest. Dan also feared that US policy was pushing toward another war between the United States and China, most immediately over Taiwan, but also in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. Now, Dan Ellsberg's concern that the US and China would go to war over Taiwan was not far-fetched at all, nor was his fear that in such a war, the US might resort to nuclear weapons. As many of you know, the Pentagon has conducted 18 war games over the United States and China, over Taiwan, and China has won all 18. What does the US do in that situation? Just a couple months ago, US Army General Minihan said he believed the US and China would be at war by 2025. Mike McCall, the Republican chair of the House Armed Services Committee, said he agreed with that assessment as much as he regretted the fact. They and other analysts fear that the US window of opportunity in the possibility of winning such a war is rapidly closing. So that's where I'd like to begin, with the idea that the US is losing hegemony over the Pacific and the unipolar world that Joe Biden came to office promising to reestablish is already over and dying, but not less dangerous. If I had more time, I was going to put this in historical perspective. I was even going to start with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. Because as many of you know, the real target of that bombing was not the people in Japan, not the people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but the Soviet Union. That the war was already won. That the United States knew that the Japanese were desperate to surrender. That the Japanese were trying to get Russian help in getting better negotiating terms. That Truman said that the Japanese were ready to surrender, and that the US went ahead and used the bomb, even though 7 of America's 8 five-star generals in 1945 said it was either militarily unnecessary, morally reprehensible, or both. Why did the US do it? Because many in the United States thought that the Cold War with the Soviet Union was beginning, and they wanted to send a message to the Soviet Union that if they messed with America's plans in Europe or in the Pacific, this is what the Soviets were going to get, and worse, and much, much worse. Even the US Navy Museum in Washington, D.C. now says that the Japanese cabinet leading up to the surrender said almost nothing about the atomic bombings. All the discussion was about the Soviet invasion of Manchuria and what that would mean for the future of Japan. But I was also going to talk about a lot of other things, but I won't have time to do so because I want to get as quickly as possible to, let me start with the end of the Cold War, because that's when American hegemony in Asia really manifests in the present form. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, in 1990, leading neoconservative thinker Charles Krauthammer wrote a report saying that this is America's unipolar moment. There is nobody left on the planet who can challenge us or threaten us. And US hegemony, unipolarity, is going to last for another 30 to 40 years. Then after the invasion of Afghanistan, in anticipation of the invasion of Iraq in 2002, Krauthammer revisited the topic. And he said, this is America. He said, I was wrong in 1990, This is not the unipolar moment. This is the unipolar era. The United States will dominate the world as far in the future as we can imagine. Nobody can challenge us. Nobody should be allowed to rise up in any part of the world who can in any way challenge the United States. That view became hegemonic under the Project for a New American Century, the George W. Bush administration, the neocons. The New York Sunday Times Magazine section headlined its cover story on January 1st, 2003, American Empire, Get Used to It. The debate was, which countries do we topple first? We start with Afghanistan and Iraq, then Syria, then Libya. They had a whole list of the countries we were going to topple. But things didn't go so well in Iraq and Afghanistan. And even by 2006, Krauthammer admitted that the moment of unipolarity was rapidly reaching an end. But meanwhile, during these years, while the Soviet Union was while Russia was revitalizing its military, it was China that was growing at the fastest rate of any country in history. In fact, China was growing approximately 5 times as fast as any other country had ever grown before that. And by 2011, the Americans realized that the real challenge was China. So in November 2011, Hillary Clinton wrote an article in Foreign Policy magazine titled America's Pacific Century, in which she says that the United States needs to pivot to Asia. We shouldn't be bogged down in the Middle East. Oil is an old concern. It is China that really represents a threat to the United States. Now, that got slowed down for a bit, and the Soviet Union, and Russia did rise up with its nuclear policies, because in 2002, the United States pulled out of the ABM treaty, and Russia began its modernization policy. And on March 1st, 2018, in Putin's State of the Nation address, he announced that Russia now has 5 new nuclear weapons, all of which can circumvent American military defense. And we can talk about that and the invasion of Ukraine later. What I want to focus on for my remaining time, and please tell me when I'm out of time because I have no idea. What I want to focus on is that during the Trump administration, the United States finally did reverse course. Trump almost precipitated a war with North Korea. And he certainly did begin a trade war with China. But when Biden took over, people had hope that the new administration was going to change policy. Well, that was a pipe dream. Biden brought with him 18 top advisors from the Center for a New American Security. Those were the super hawks. And their concern was not really Russia. Their concern was China. These are people like Sullivan, like Campbell, like Eli Ratner, and they began game planning for war with China. And what we've seen, especially under Biden, was not pulling back, not lessening tension, increasing tension. We see Biden strengthening the Quad, the alliance between Japan, the US, Australia, and India. Just look at these countries. Japan, which I'm sure we'll talk about more, has effectively undermined Article 9 of the Peace Constitution. Under Kishida, Japan is going to double its defense spending. Japan is now going to support the US military, not only over Taiwan, but over all its military adventures in the Pacific. At the recent G7 meeting in Hiroshima, how obscene and shameful was it to hold a war council talking about confrontation with Russia and China in Hiroshima, of all places? That is unconscionable. But we look at South Korea under Moon, a right-wing government that's looking for confrontation with North Korea. We've seen massive war games between the United States and South Korea and Japan as well now, including nuclear-capable bombers, aircraft carriers. Australia, the AUKUS agreement might have undermined France, but it militarizes Australia in unprecedented ways with nuclear submarines and massive defense spending. The Philippines, the United States just announced that it was opening 4 new military bases in the Philippines. Modi, India. Modi is now visiting the United States. I've been asked by all Indian TV networks to do interviews about Modi's visit. And the point to make is that the reason why the United States was so desperate to strengthen ties with India is to use India against China. Now, how does it hope to use India against China? Not necessarily in terms of military forces, but in terms of research and manufacturing capability. What the Ukraine war has shown is that the US does not have the military industrial capability to build up the kind of forces and weapons that it needs to even fight in Ukraine against Russia. But India does have that capability. And that's what the United States wants to use India for. We can get into that in more detail also. But the other recent development is Blinken's visit to Beijing, which was initially canceled after the spy balloon in February. But the United States begged Beijing to allow Blinken to come. But if you follow that visit, all the optics, everything about it, it was a complete failure on the US part, because China sees not only the US as a declining empire, but it sees China as an extremely hostile, aggressive force. And China is pushing back. It began in March of 2021, the meeting in Anchorage between Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi and Blinken and Sullivan, which after a 2-minute US presentation, the Chinese responded with an 18-minute diatribe condemning the United States for hypocrisy, for aggression, for war making. Then on March of this year, Xi Jinping accused the United States of all-around containment, encirclement, and suppression. The month before that, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Wang Wenbin responded to a State Department statement about China and Russia and said the U.S. is the #1 warmonger in the world. The U.S. accounted for about 80% of all post-World War II armed conflicts. The U.S. is also the #1 violator of sovereignty and the #1 interferer in the internal affairs of other countries. Since the end of World War II, the U.S. has sought to subvert more than 50 foreign leaders. The U.S. is also the #1 source of antagonism and bloc confrontation. Well, who agrees with that position? None other than former U.S. President Jimmy Carter, who said not too long ago that the U.S. was the most warlike nation in the history of the world. He said, since 1979, do you know how many times China has been at war with anybody? He says none, while the United States has stayed at war. He says that at that point, that the United States have been at peace for only 16 out of the 242 years that the United States had existed as a nation. What we see now is an emerging multipolar world that the U.S. is trying to stop. And the U.S. is strengthening all of its military alliances. Some are focused at Russia, but most are focused at China at this point. But there are multipolar organizations emerging: the SCO, the BRICS, the Belt and Road Initiative, the de-dollarization. The reality, though, is that the United States is not willing to yield its hegemony and its domination. And it is building up the forces to get ready for that military confrontation and the likelihood of war over Taiwan, but not only over Taiwan. There are so many hotspots now that we really have to be aware of, which brings us back to Dan Ellsberg. Dan Ellsberg was the most eloquent, articulate warner, the voice about the dangers of nuclear war. And those dangers are real. And it's not only the madmen in the United States. Putin also, the threat of using nuclear weapons over the confrontation in Ukraine is as insane on Putin's part as it is on Biden's part. And what we have to realize is that there is no place in this world for nuclear weapons, and that all of these conflicts that could possibly lead to a new confrontation must be eliminated. As President Kennedy, the last sane president the United States had, said 60 years ago in his American University commencement address, There are so many parts that I would like to read, but I'll just read a couple. He said, "What kind of peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war, but the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, that enables men and women to grow and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women, not merely peace in our time, but peace for all time." And he went on and said, "Let us re-examine our attitude toward the Cold War." He called for an end to the Cold War. Called for, he said, so important, he said, "Nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which brings an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age will be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world." And it's that madness. And he said, we have to make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. And that was Dan Ellsberg's message. And the best tribute we can give to him is to follow through on that and eliminate nuclear weapons and defuse these insane tensions that are leading us to war. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. That was rousing. Thank you so much for your presentation, for the important, critical background, sobering, but very, very important, and the incredibly comprehensive overview and quick overview of U.S. imperial aggression, as well as a moving tribute to the great Daniel Ellsberg. Please do find out more about Peter's work. His other books include Rethinking the Atomic Bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japanese and American Perspectives, and many others. Look very, very forward to hearing more from you, Peter, in the Q&A. I do want to remind people to put their questions in the Q&A box. We'll get to as many as we can, time permitting. I see that we have more than 100 people today on the live Zoom, which is wonderful, and great to see so many people with interest in these important matters. Our next speaker, live from Okinawa, is Satoko Oka Norimatsu. Satoko is a native of Tokyo and a resident of the west coast of Canada for 3 decades. Satoko writes and speaks on war memory, historical justice, and decolonization in the Asia-Pacific region. She is co-author with Gavin McCormick of Resistant Islands, Okinawa Confronts Japan and the United States. She's a regular contributor to the Okinawa newspaper, Ryukyu Shimpo. Welcome, Satoko.
Thank you, Bianca. And hello, everyone from Okinawa. I really want to thank Peter for such an inspiring talk that gave an overview of what's going on in Asia Pacific in terms of the US hegemony. Thanks, Bianca, the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute and Canada China Focus for organizing an event with us. I've lived on the west coast of Canada for 30 years, what is called Vancouver, but the First Nations people's land, the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh Nation. That's where I normally live. And right now, I'm in Okinawa, Ryukyu. I'm also on the indigenous land. I appreciate this opportunity that I'm here in the Okinawan Ryukyu and indigenous people's land. And this is a very special time of the year. Today is June 22nd. And tomorrow will be a War Memorial Day in Okinawa, June 23rd. 78 years ago, the Okinawa was made one of the most fierce battlegrounds of the Asia-Pacific War. It's the last land battleground where there were about 500,000 people living in Okinawa and there's so many hundred thousands evacuated, displaced, and more than 100,000 or maybe 150,000 Okinawan people were forcibly mobilized to war and killed in this war. So 1 out of 3 or 1 out of 4 person in Okinawa was killed. So I'm here in this room with my Okinawan friends, and there's no one in Okinawa whose family has not been affected by this war. And there's an important message here. The people in Okinawa, they know that the military does not save lives. Military is there to kill lives. And the war never ended in Okinawa because after the war, the Chobin's going to talk more about this later. It's been occupied by the United States military and also the Japanese military, which is not on the decrease, it's on the increase, as Peter suggested. So I'm going to move on to talk about my role today is to talk about the Canadian role in this militarization of the Pacific. I'm going to share my screen. So as Peter said, about a month ago, there was a G7, the Western Leaders Summit in Hiroshima. I was actually there to protest what Peter calls the War Council. It was a warmongers council, literally. And on the sideline, Prime Minister Kishida and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau met, and they pledged a closer coordination in addressing China and North Korea issues. They also confirmed that the G7, including Japan and Canada, will continue to coordinate closely to impose sanctions against Russia and provide support for Ukraine. So this was all about putting blame on the Western adversary countries, China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. And they did that right in Hiroshima, as you see these 7 leaders. They're not going to eliminate nuclear weapons. They're going to actually intensify the war, intensify the nuclearization of the world. And how, what kind of guts do they have in front of over 200,000 people who were killed in the Hiroshima bombing? And this Hiroshima vision that they put forward, they were again very hostile to this China, Russia, DPRK, and Iran. And the essence of that vision was very well depicted by a Canadian Hiroshima survivor, Setsuko Thurlow. She said, "It is unacceptable that the G7 nations send out a message that only condemns nuclear weapons held by adversary countries while affirming their own nuclear weapons from a place that suffered the atomic bomb." She well depicted that double standard. And this is American University professor David Vine's book, United States of War. There are maps from this. And we in the West should always remind ourselves that it is we who are encircling China and Russia and DPRK and Iran with this 800 US military installations. And we're doing this, and these countries, I mean, if you look to the map on the right, this is not happening. Iran and China and North Korea and Russia, they are not encircling Canada and United States with these bases. This is we who are the adversaries, not them. So Canada is an active participant in this. And this, to me and to my colleagues in Canada, I'm just appalling picture Canada exercising in tandem with Imperial Japan. This is Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Forces, which still uses the Imperial Japan Rising Sun flags. And can you imagine the Canadian maple in the military operation with this imperial force? Like if you look in the past, the Asia Pacific countries that were invaded, occupied, and killed by the Imperial Japan, they will never forget this flag. As soon as they see flag, this will remind them of the Japanese aggression and atrocities during the war, depicted in this left picture, the Korean resistance against the use of imperial flags by Japan, and they demanded that the Tokyo Olympics of 2020 would ban the use of this flag, but they didn't. Anyway, this is history, and here is another exercise called Noble Wolf, involving US, Canada, Japan, and Australia. This is only recent, this month in East China Sea. The USS Chunhun and the Canadian frigate HMCS Montreal carried out a freedom navigation operation in the Taiwan Strait. Again, freedom of navigation, like whose freedom of navigation? And China, Japan, we're Asian country, we have freedom. And the United States and Canada and other Western allies, they're demanding, oh, we have the freedom, you don't have the freedom. And here's another exercise, Japan, US, Australia, Canada, joint maritime exercise. It's called Keen Sword. All these names of the exercise are just incredible. They're in the Philippine Sea, and the Japanese ground forces troops disembarking an MV-22B Osprey during the Keen Sword 23 at the Camp Ainoura. This is Sasebo. Sasebo is in Kyushu, near Nagasaki, another huge US and Japan maritime, the Navy base. And Canada is part of this ship from the US Navy, the British, Australian, Canadian, American, and again, Imperial Japan warship exercise. And Canada has been part of this, it has been engaged in this thing called Operation Neon since 2008, and it's supposed to continue into 2026. Canada deploys military ships, aircraft, and personnel to conduct surveillance operations to identify suspected maritime sanctions evasion activities by DPRK. In particular, ship-to-ship transfers of fuel and other commodities banned by the United Nations Security Council resolution. So here's Canadian CP-140 Aurora and HMCS Vancouver. This is from October last year. This is off the coast of Kure. Kure is near Hiroshima. It's another US or Japanese maritime defense force base. The HMCS Vancouver concludes Operation Neon, and they're all smiling and celebrating. Yeah, we're here doing the right thing, good thing. But is it? So what Canada and other allies are doing under the name of UN, is it really true? Like last year, April, May 2022, Canada complained about Chinese aircraft buzzing Canada's CP-140 Aurora, and Justin Trudeau called it irresponsible and provocative. But what is Canada doing at the far end of the Pacific anyway? And the Chinese government said the UN Security Council has never authorized any country to carry out military surveillance in the seas and airspace of other countries in the name of enforcing sanctions. So here's the important difference. And China is actually right. It is true that the United Nations sanctions against North Korea is in place, but the UN has, there's no UN sanctioned, UN approved operations to enforce sanctions. So it's just Canada and US and other countries just using the UN name. And Canada is certainly in Okinawa, where we are. The Canadian Air Force armed forces, ships and aircraft are spotted by the Okinawan media. For example, this is October last year on the left side, the CP-140 Aurora again, and CC-150 Polaris at Cadena. So these are for the Operation Neon, and Canadian aircraft are using the Ryukyuan indigenous land for this operation. And this was reported in the Ryukyu Shimpo, one of the two local Okinawa newspapers, and Royal Canadian Navy Halifax-class frigate HMCS Montreal, again, moored at White Beach, the naval facility in Okinawa. And this is only a few weeks ago. And their rationale is Canada's ongoing naval forward presence mission to promote peace and stability in support of the rules-based international order. Of course, we all know that this is not a rule-based international order. This is a U.S. rule-based, U.S. hegemonic order. That's exactly what it is, and people here will know it. So this is not an exhaustive, but the summary of what I just presented. Canada's in the Japanese naval bases, Kure and Yokosuka, and they're in the Yellow Sea, East China Sea, South China Sea, the Philippine Sea, and right over in Okinawa. They're everywhere. And I just wanted to finish by touching on the militarization of what we call Nansei Island. This is a chain of islands, the Ryukyu chain of islands. So these islands are all carry traditional indigenous Ryukyu cultures and languages. There's so many of them. Shinako will talk about them later. And on top of already existing 30 or so US military bases, the Japan self-defense forces, hand in hand with the United States, they're putting the missile bases and more ground self-defense force bases, despite the persistent resistance and opposition by the local people, because again, as I said, the people here know that the presence of military do not protect them, and they put them in danger. Under the name of the China's maritime advances, so-called. China has total freedom to go through this public sea, but the Japan and US and other allied nations, they want to block China's passage of this sea between Kagoshima and Japan and Taiwan. And you don't see that these islands are hardly visible, but almost 1.5 million people live on these islands, including this main island, the Okinawa Island. So I again, thank you very much for this opportunity. I probably spoke too long, so I'm going to talk about the more of the international solidarity action later, but I'd like to hand it over to Chobin now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Satoko. Thank you for enlightening us to Canada's role as well in this process of militarization. There's so much clarity in your presentation, including pointing out where the real aggression is coming from, the encirclement that we're seeing. Thank you so much again for just this important historical context, as well as the analysis, current event analysis from like Operation, the Operation Nobel work. So thank you for your analysis. Thank you for your activism. I look so forward to hearing more from you in the Q&A. Next, we're going to hear from Chobin Zukeran. Chobin is a leader of the anti-war and peace movement in Okinawa. He's director, Ryukyu Okinawa Center, East Asian Community Institute in Okinawa, Japan. He was mayor of Nanjo City from 2018 to 2022, and a member of the House of Representatives of Japan from 2009 to 2012. Chobin is also joined by his colleagues in Okinawa, Shinako Oyakawa and Miyuki Kamiya. Welcome, Chobin. Welcome, Shinako. Welcome, Miyuki.
I'm Chobin Zukeran. Nice to see you. First of all, thank you very much, Bianca-san and Canadian Foreign Policy Institute for giving us a chance to speak out through the media. Well, the Okinawa, first of all, where's Okinawa? Let me show you the map. Well, yesterday I drew a map, very easy to see this one. Well, Okinawa has many islands, and as you see, Okinawa is very close to Taiwan, and as I told you, we have 160 islands in Okinawa. And the biggest island is called Okinawa-jima. And we also have Yonaguni Island. And Yonaguni is very close to Taiwan, 110 kilometers between Taiwan and Yonaguni. So it's very close to Taiwan. Okay, thank you. And as you see, Japan and China, and Okinawa is kind of middle of East Asia. And Okinawa also has a history, very close history to China. Almost 700, over 700 years, very talented Chinese people came to Okinawa, maybe sent to Okinawa, Ryukyu. At that time, Ryukyu came to Okinawa, maybe sent to Okinawa, Ryukyu. At that time, Ryukyu. And these Chinese people, over 700 years ago, they brought very high skills at that time to Ryukyu, culture or literature. And between that, China and Okinawa, we have very close history. So as Japan or the USA is saying crisis of China or Taiwan Sea, we Okinawan people, we don't see crisis between China and Okinawa because of background of history. Well, we'll talk about this later. And as I told you before, Ryukyu, Okinawa was a part of Japan now politically, but 150 years ago, Okinawa was a Ryukyu kingdom, a nation, independent nation. But 1609, Satsuma clan of Japan invaded Okinawa and took the control from Ryukyu kingdom. And 1879, Ryukyu kingdom was corrupted by Japan. And so historically, and our identity, I was in the United States for 3 years when I was young. I was told, where are you from? I was answering, I'm from Okinawa. So my identity, I realized at that time, my identity is not Japan or Japanese. I'm Okinawa, or I'm Ryukyu. About 40 years ago, I realized. So Ryukyu people or Okinawa people has, I think, the same emotion talking about identity with me too. And now I'm showing you one article of a local newspaper. You see PFAS on the article. The water problem is one of the biggest issues in Okinawa too. And the article says, we ask US to allow us to into US bases to investigate or check the water. But US doesn't allow us. And the Japanese government, the answer is, we are waiting for permission from US. That's what article says. And this article is May 15th, 2023. So about a month ago, oh, this is what's happening in Okinawa. And then in Japan too. Japanese government cannot say U.S. to no answer, as you know. So I would say, or a lot of Okinawan people think that is Japan independent country, or Japan maybe a puppet of United States of America. And so Japanese government cannot save the life of Okinawan people or Japanese people. That's what's happening now in Okinawa and Japan. And talking about the U.S. Military bases, this is the biggest island of Okinawa, Okinawa-jima. And these blue color or brown color is U.S. military bases. And this biggest island of Okinawa, almost 14.7% of land is occupied by U.S. Military. And on the sea, blue or circle or triangle, this is the air military, U.S. Military power is occupying air and the sea. So that's what's happening in Okinawa. I'll talk about it later. If you have any questions, I'll pass to Shinako.